before we dive in, I want to go through like a few house rules and kind of go over how today is going to work. Um, basically, I'm going to get started with Craig and kind of ask some questions. We are going to dive into spoilers for Finch. So if you have not seen it, one, why haven't you watched it yet? And two, I'm sorry, but we're going to talk about it. We're going to take this thing apart and talk through the movie and dive into it. Second, if you have a question, you're going to have the opportunity to come on stage and ask directly. So you can do so by waving your hand. So there should be like a little wave button. And that'll show that you want to come on stage and ask something. And then as we work through the questions, I will go through those that have raised their hands. We have a text channel going. So if you'd like to chat while Craig is answering a question or dive in or talk about whatever kind of coffee you're drinking, there is a text channel available for you as well. I ask that if you do come on stage, if you end up being a troll or just kind of not being nice, we're just going to ban you from the whole server. So just be aware that be respectful and that you are, in a sense, putting yourself in public. And I know that's something that we haven't done a lot of in the last couple of years. So let's all be in our best behaviors. Okay, so Craig Luck began in the winter of 1988. After growing up and initially pursuing a career in aviation, he later U-turned and steadied himself on his other passion in life, film. In education, several jobs, phone calls, meetings, and friendships later, he started working as a technician on movie sets. It was during this time that he began writing his first screenplay, a feature film based on a short story he had written years ago, Finch. Presently, Craig is now based in Minneapolis with his wife and daughter and is writing several new screenplays, all whilst enjoying his new pilot's license. Craig, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just dive right into Finch. I want to start with like, where did this idea come from? It's because it's such I went through so many tissues and tears. I watched this on a plane and I was just weeping, and I can't imagine what the people sitting next to me were thinking as I was watching this. But where did this idea come from and how did it come to life?
It all came to light for me in 2009. It was my last year at film school, and it was the first time that we as sort of students were let off the leash, is what I like to call it. And up until that point, the first and second year were all to make films that met the curriculum at the time. And I've always thought they almost wanted us to make Mike Leigh films, and as much as I love Mike Leigh, I don't want to be the next Mike Leigh. So the type of movies that we were expected to make just didn't necessarily sing my tunes. So in third year, our final year, it was far more of a broad landscape and horizon that we could shoot for in terms of whatever we wanted to make. And the first thing I turned to was genre, because I just thought, well, this is my opportunity. And then I started thinking, well, what story do I want to write in genre? And I immediately started to think about science fiction. There was almost like I can't remember the specific movies that I was watching during the time, but I just remember like a glut of science fiction movies that always just felt like they held me at arm's length, which science fiction can do. It can be a very cold genre. So I sat down and thought, well, if I want to write in science fiction, what science fiction story could I tell that my grandparents would want to watch, that I would be happy to sort of sit down and say, this is a movie that I've made and they're actually going to enjoy it outside of just, oh, this is Craig's movie. This is a film that they're genuinely going to engage in and enjoy. And then reverse engineering that, it was kind of like, well, the most human story possible, or at least a very human story, is the gateway to anyone's heart. And especially with science fiction, it was almost like a shortcut from the genre itself to the story being told. So in thinking about that, I then started to think, well, what is it that makes a human story human? And just more than anything, it's just how much you align with that story, how much you may see of yourself, or how much you may understand of just the very simple nature of a predicament, let's say. Instead of inventing too much and therefore explaining too much. It was just, what would people understand on a very core level? And at the time, I I was in London. I grew up in the southwest of England, and the family dog of 15 years was in very poor health, just almost overnight, and he had to be euthanized almost like the next day after finding out what was going on. And it was just nowhere near enough time for me to even get back home to say my goodbyes, right? And this is a dog that I'd known from forever, as far as I was concerned at the time. And so I had to do everything over the phone, which is all heartbreaking stuff, right? It just affected me on such a level that emotion and energy found its way into what I was doing at the time, which was trying to come up with this story. And it's interesting because I remember listening to Tarantino on Charlie Rose years ago, and he was saying that if you're an actor on Broadway and you're going to a performance that evening, and on the way you hit a dog, funnily enough, it was about a dog as well, then you're going to take that experience with you on stage that evening, if not for the next couple of evenings. And if you, I mean, that's the nature of human beings, right? You take your experiences into something. And he used the same analogy for his writing as well, which is where he explained where the quarter pounder with cheese came from, because he wrote Pulp Fiction in Amsterdam. And I always thought that was quite interesting, because in hindsight, looking back on it, that's how that story came to be. Because at the time, I wasn't really conscious of it. You know, it wasn't like, I'm going to write my dog into this screenplay now. It was just the emotion found its way into it. So this essentially, it started off as a 17-page screenplay that I wrote in my as my final major project, that I never got the chance to shoot at film school because I just didn't have the time or the dime to make it there, which is why I continued to pursue it afterwards.
That's amazing. And thinking about, something that you said to me the other day about how the best sci-fi stories have something truly interesting and to say about the human experience, and seeing that direct connection to the passing of a dog in your family, and how that kind of was the impetus for this entire story, and you built in this sci-fi world and this genre world
Right.
as something that could be produced but still had the core element of like, this is something that is important to me, it's something that I want to say.
Right. And it's funny because obviously when I was coming up with it at film school, I never dreamed of it even making it to the movie that it's become now. But it certainly came from just, what story can I tell with a very epic world that is incredibly intimate in its story? And funnily enough, it's that sort of pairing, is what I would discover years and years later is almost like the secret sauce when you're in a room. Um, it's that idea of, this is the world, but here's the hook, and it's within a sentence that you've almost sold the story. Because it becomes more undeniable when someone turns around and says, "I see it. I know exactly what this movie is," without you having to wax on lyrical for 5 or 10 minutes explaining the machinations of what makes this story work. And at the time, obviously, I wasn't aware of any of that. It was just what speaks to me at this point in my life, and how do I make that even more interesting by pairing it up to a genre that I deeply love. And it just so happened that that's almost exactly what sells. I've always, and it's difficult to find those stories. It's difficult to find the ones that just seem so simple that it's kind of like, this must have been made before. Just that idea that it and just to just take 2 steps backwards for a moment, that's exactly why this movie remains so simple throughout. It was just, we don't need can we write a screenplay that doesn't include a villain in its prototypical
Hmm.
sense, or a B plot line? You know, can this story function just purely on its that very simple nature of the predicament that this man finds himself in at the end of the world? Because by doing that, then that obviously returns the focus inward, which was very much what spoke to me all those years ago and what has maintained throughout all these years. Um,
Right.
so not to take too many steps forward in your line of questions, but it all goes back to where this thing came from for me, you know, and that's something that I've always remained very proud of, is that throughout the entire development process for me personally, with it becoming a short story into a feature, that has been the one true thing. Outside of that one line that I mentioned to you the other day, Mark, which is something I only discovered myself a couple of weeks ago. There's a single line in the movie which says it's Finch feeding the dog in the opening scenes when he gets back to the bunker for the first time, and he drinks his whiskey, puts the food down for the dog, and the dog doesn't eat, and he drinks his whiskey, and it says, "Don't worry about me, you carry on." That line was in the very first draft of the very first short story that I'd written all those years ago in 2009, and it actually persisted all the way through to the final film, which I didn't realize myself until just the other day. It's kind of funny what stays and what goes, but some things are so endemic to the story that they just stick around. You know, it
Yeah,
just speaks to the nature of where this thing started. You know, which was just this man and this dog's unwavering relationship for one another.
that's amazing. Um, okay, so I have one more question, and then we'll get people asking their own questions. So if people want to start raising
Oh.
their hands, we'll jump into the queue. So my question is, give me that moment that you found out that Tom Hanks was signing on, and like, what was that like? What did you say to your wife? Like, what? Put me in the head of Craig Luck when he gets that phone call.
Um. Okay, so let me get this right. Um. Certainly, my wife and I, we weren't married at the time. That much I can tell you straight off the bat. I was, as you mentioned in your opening, I was working on movie sets. That was what was keeping my head above waters financially for 6 years, and I was working as a video technician. And the reality of the movie became the most apparent when we landed Image Movers, which was Robert Zemeckis' company. They were the first sort of major element to come on board, and it was working with the team that we would, okay, who do we see in this role? And obviously, we had a very short list, and I mean, the name that was always at the top of that list was Tom Hanks, because it was like, this script was never written for him. Why would it ever be? But it became more and more obvious that he would be absolutely perfect for the role. And fortunately for us, Robert Zemeckis and Tom Hanks have worked together quite a lot. So it was literally within 24 hours of us all saying, Tom Hanks is the way to go. Let's get it to Tom. Of Tom receiving the script, printing it off. He likes to read hard copies, and turning around to us and saying, "Yes, I want to do it." It was him reading the script, him sitting down with Miguel, the director, and I was told that he had two questions. When does the movie start shooting, and can he be in it? That was genuinely what he asked Miguel. And then obviously when all of that was going on, I was driving to set. It was a very cold, very wet and windy day, and we were shooting on location, so it's going to be miserable. I just pulled up in a multi-story car park at 7 in the morning, and literally there was an email that I hadn't yet read because I think I was a little bit late, and sure enough, there it was. It was just quite simply, Tom Hanks is in. And it was obviously, it takes more than a moment for that type of news to sink in, I suppose. but I still had to compose myself and open the car door and go eat breakfast and get on with work. And I've always said that I very much separated what I was doing outside of what I was hired to do on sets, and what I was doing outside of it. And so very few people knew of anything really that I was chipping away as a writer, and certainly that I actually had a movie that was actively getting closer and closer to shooting, and here we were just casting Tom Hanks. So very few people knew, but obviously when even one person knowing, it sort of spreads like wildfire. So it was it just to cap that story off, between us casting Tom and us going out with the package, was close to a year. It was January that he came on, and it was January of 2017 and October of 2017 that the movie, we went out with the package, and we did that just purely so for Miguel's schedule to sort of clear up a little bit more. The last thing we wanted to do was go out with it as a package too early, and then we're forced to sit on it until Miguel's schedule cleared up, because obviously when people have time, they like to fiddle and noodle with stuff, and none of us wanted to do that. So we went out at that time, and then there was it went out on a Friday, and then all the bids came in on the Monday, and there were multiple bids. But then at the 11th hour, Steven Spielberg got on the phone with Miguel and literally spent an hour convincing him why it's perfectly suited to Amblin. And I remember hearing the news that it had sold, the whole package had sold to Amblin, when I was on set of Solo, the Star Wars story.
Wow.
And I was on set of Second Unit. And it was, I think, again, very few people knew. It was one of those things that I had to sort of contain to myself and get on with the job. But the person I was working with, the video operator, obviously knew, and the DIT department, all the people sort of like that actually I've worked with directly, and also Brad Allen, the Second Unit director. He was someone that I thought of very fondly, and he knew, and he was. It was so charming how over the moon he was. It was just one of those things. Obviously, he passed this year, but it's a memory that I hold very near and dear. It was nice to have that sort of support, even within a very professional environment. That I had always felt like I'd always wanted to separate, but that moment where it was just it was the most immediate validation, was that for me. It was very sweet.
What a special moment to like be able to share that with your colleagues and have them just get
Right.
so excited right away.
Right.
Okay, so let's start bringing some people on stage to ask questions. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand by clicking the little hand button. So we'll bring our first question on stage. So I invited to speak. So hopefully Bamugo, I assume I'm saying that correctly, will join us on stage and he can ask his question.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Craig, for giving us this opportunity to chat with you.
Thank you.
So I'm a dad, and as a dad, Finch's relationship and failures, particularly his failures with Jeff, really resonated with me. And I'm curious how much of Finch's character was based on your own thoughts and feelings about building and leaving your own legacy.
Wow. Very interesting. I think, well, certainly I would answer that first and foremost by saying that I myself became a father. It was during the shoot. My wife and I had just come back from New Mexico, where the shoot happened, and that's where we sort of found out the news, because at first it was kind of like, oh, maybe it's just jet lag and things like this. No, it turned out that we were having a kid. And so obviously my journey as a father never really directly influenced the screenplay. However, my journey with my own father certainly did. It was obviously Finch's relationship with his father is very tumultuous, and it was very thin. as far as his relationship goes. And mine is a lot stronger than that. However, my mum and dad did divorce when I was at high school, and that had a profound effect on me because it was an overnight thing for me in terms of, everyday life. To no, this is how it's going to be. It was a Sunday afternoon that I'd literally found out the news, and that was the day he also moved out. So there were a lot of like emotions and feelings from that developed as the screenplay turned from a short story into a feature script. In fact, that was obviously the real character drama of the feature script. So that became more and more apparent really in subsequent drafts. One of the things that we very quickly realized was that this is very much a story about the journey, and not all about just, okay, A to B, C to D checkpoints, and what do we do here? How do the scenes make any difference? But it was more about the roller coaster of this man who really should never have been a father in himself, or never, at least never wanted to be one, and certainly never the last bastion of humanity. But here he is having to be both in order to do what he wants to do, which is protect the life of his dog. And so from in looking at that and sort of reverse engineering that, it became easier and easier to start to say, well, these are the things that he's going to not be as good at as he would be over here. And his relationship with his father was a big deal of that. And obviously, when you're facing the end of your life, then obviously inevitably you start looking back, and then you do start considering your legacy and things like this. And there was actually a line in the script that never made it to the screen, and it was a quote from St. Augustine, which said, "The world is a book, and those that do not travel read only one page." And I think that that's incredibly true. And there's a big element of that, obviously, that even though the line was removed, the thematic of that maintained throughout the entire, and became quite a big thing in the feature. And that's something that I felt was just incredibly interesting when you pair up all of those elements, put them in a big melting pot, which is to say you've got this man that never wanted to really be a father, but is having to impart his own wisdom and his own experiences on this character who isn't quote unquote human, and it's almost like you're trying to short him get into a point where he can understand at least emotion, not have emotion necessarily himself, because obviously there's a big question mark and everything over that, but also just at least understanding it, so he can therefore apply that to what a dog may need and require. And I felt that was a very arresting dynamic. It was one of those ways of making it speak on a personal level, but B, also not just about, it's not action scenes. And in fact, the action scenes of the movie are just there to service the character development. Take the scene when they potentially meet people and they're pursued on the road and they're forced into the underpass. Obviously, that is excitement, and the job of the screenwriter is to put those into the screenplay, but that was always in service of the character, which is why the people never get out of the car and they have a big confrontation and Walking Dead standoff moment or whatever. It was purely designed to push Finch to a place where he has to confess part of his past in order for Jeff to understand where he's coming from. And all of that, obviously, that all leads up to that picnic scene, which is very much about legacy and past experiences and regrets and things like that. And I suppose more than anything, to make a very long answer short, it's something that I think we all want, especially when you have children, which I've come to realize is that you want to be able to look back and have the least, if not zero, regrets, and especially when it comes to your children and their future. So it sort of it galvanized itself once I'd had a child of my own. It's funny how it sort of took on a completely different life once we'd had Mila. It's strange.
Awesome. Thank you for that, and thank you for the question. And for those listening in, Smish is going through one of your older drafts that's actually in the Hive under a different title called BIOS, and
Yes.
pulling up the lines that you mentioned.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so it's pretty cool to kind of see those lines still existing. And it
Yeah.
actually does come up if you search Finch. So if anyone is interested in reading the draft that was on the blacklist around the same time that it actually was going into production, that is in the Hive. So let's bring our next question up on stage.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. I really loved your movie because the way you wrote the outskirts of the climate and then the inner turmoil between, like, the robot as a contrast to Tom Hanks developing himself as well, and like the dog kind of leading it all with no words. It was amazing. And one of my favorite scenes, like the one you were just talking about with the car, is when Finch when he's pushing the car under the bridge to like fix the mistake almost, and like the camera spending all this time showing like the destruction of the entire car. He's just like pushing it, like we'll fix it, and then that almost like forces opening up from Tom's character and like having to talk about the past, and that whole build up scene just stood out to me so well because there's no gun. I mean, there's not like explosions going on at all. It's just the tension of the camera angles, and then the van. It was just really well written.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. It was 100% that, you know, that idea of how many, because let me just put it this way. The Jeff as a entity in the script was always meant to go from toddler to teenager into adulthood. That was always supposed to be his character arc. And if you do read the screenplay, which is on the Hive, you'll see that there is a number of pages in the script that have been removed from the 17 pages, I think, was the final draft. So, but that's the way these things go sometimes, I suppose. And so the reason I mentioned that is because his character arc was always supposed to go from, you know, these sort of more physical mistakes that he makes, his blunders in that sense, and, you know, you get some comedy from that as well. And then more towards the his teenager years, it was more of a like a mental challenge between the two of them. As Jeff's coming into his own, he's pushing Finch for answers who doesn't necessarily have them himself. And I always felt like that's a really interesting place to find two people, especially, well, I say people, but two beings, especially when one's human and one's not. And, you know, you're trying to ask advice from someone that isn't the best person to ask advice from. There's comedy and drama in that all in one. And then finally, once Finch dies, which was around in the script, it was sort of like the 70-minute mark, maybe 80-minute mark. There was still that half an hour left to go with Jeff on his own and having to make those decisions himself and those mistakes by himself. And obviously that was the story. It was always about Jeff and his journey, and the mistakes that he makes, but also all of this advice that he gets from Finch, who is, for all intents and purposes, his father. All of these, whether they're small pockets of wisdom or whether they're warnings, whatever they may be, he realizes that some of them are true, but a lot of them are not. And the people that they do meet along the rest of the journey alone aren't exactly the people that Finch had always warned them about. And there was something interesting in that because it further developed that theme, that core theme of trust, which was put into the script very early as well. And it's always sad to sort of speak about these scenes because there was so much put into them, which I felt really benefited the story. But obviously, it came down to it that the movie was running too long. And by removing them, funnily enough, the film became far more introspective. It was much more about that immediate journey between the three of them, as opposed to what happens thereafter. But I do miss them because I always felt like it was kind of a ballsy move to kill off Tom Hanks and still have half an hour to go. But I suppose when it came down to it, it's kind of like, well, maybe we can't keep people in seats after that, But I always thought it was kind of like John Doe turning himself in Seven, when you still got those like half an hour, 40 minutes to go. It's kind of like, where's it going to go from here? But listen, I really, I don't know if this answers your question, but I really appreciate your compliments. Thank you so much.
It does, because like my friend lost his dog like 2 days after I saw your film, and
Wow.
I was yeah,
It's awful. It is awful.
it was odd. Like
you project so much of yourself onto your pets. You
I
almost
get a
like
text message. He's
instill.
like, Slim died, and I was just thinking, like in that sequence in the
Right.
film between how you wrote Tom
Right,
Hanks,
and that it's
saying to
Finch has
just
done that to
looking
the dog,
into the
and
robot
then
and saying, "I wish I could
ultimately
see you
he's done
grow
that
up."
for Jeff. His own. They've sort of their relationship has grown to that point where he would like to see him in 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, because that one line stood out to me, because your writing just like, even if all the editing took place, there's something about the way you got the characters developed that was just so great to watch. Because it's almost like watching like it was like watching like a literal portrait being played out on screen, because you had these special effects in the background, but the camera was always focused on like Tom Hanks' face while he was dealing with like anger, rage, depression, sadness. Like,
right. And that was a very important thing. And in fact, that was the way we shot it as well, right from day dot. Miguel always said, I want to shoot this as if it's a family drama. I don't want to shoot this as a science fiction movie where one of the co-star is a CGI character. I just want to shoot this as if it's just the three of us together in this RV, and certainly that's the way we did it, because every single scene that Tom Hanks is in, Caleb Landry Jones, who played Jeff, is in as well. He literally wore a suit, this faux cap suit that had all these tracking markers on it, and some mass as well, like around his arms and his face, and so he had that as a physical movement. And every single scene was just shot exactly how you would shoot it if it was just two humans on screen, and then later it was the 3D CGI puppet was imposed. So that also was very central to the thematics of the script, and the core emotion of it, in that it's very sort of independent spirit, heart and soul to the movie. So even though it's got this big backdrop, so yeah, but that certainly influenced the way we shot it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rugby. Excellent. So moving on, switching time. And again, if you guys have questions, just raise your hand and we'll kind of work through the list here. So invite our next guest up. And Finch may be very happy, Craig, that my wife and I got a dog and we selected the breed that doesn't grow old and die. So we just don't have to experience any of that. So that's really nice.
I'm still looking for that breed. You'll have to tell me.
Yeah, I'll shoot you a note.
Thank you for your time, Craig. I appreciate you being here and
Thank you.
everything you've mentioned so far. You're a great speaker and you seem like a really nice guy.
Thanks.
I'm actually headed to film school in spring of 2023, and I'm going for directing and writing. Directing is my primary interest, but I love writing as well. And I wanted to ask, like it caught my attention when you mentioned that, like the core idea of this and development kind of started at the tail end of your film school time, it sounded like.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, kind of with that in mind, do you have any guidance or advice or, like philosophical principles that might help out while I'm headed there? Because I definitely I know there's a lot to learn and I want to grow and change as a writer and director, but I also like a lot of the ideas I have, and I really love that you were able to maintain this all the way from then to now, like a decade later, having it made.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's very long journey. Much like the core idea itself, it wasn't an overnight thing. It took a long time for it to grow from that short story into the screenplay that it ultimately got made into a film. The advice I can give you for film school is just to remain true to yourself and what you want to achieve at the end of the day, because obviously I can't speak for every institution, but for most, obviously they walk a very narrow path of whatever the curriculum may be. So for me, it was always a bit of a struggle, I suppose, because that meant making films that would score me the better grades, let's say, or producing papers that would score me the better grades in terms of what I was really genuinely interested in. And for a while I kind of resented that, and that's certainly why I think that when you read interviews with the auteurs of the world, whether it's Tarantino or Paul Thomas Anderson or whomever, they all like up. I went there for a week and I dropped out. I kind of get that, because obviously you do have to be a student of the system in order to get through that. And obviously for many people, the nature of making films is like the antithesis of that. So I think as long as you can if you can separate that mindset, or at least if you're conscious of it, then it can be a real hoot, and it certainly was for me. I really did enjoy my time at film school, and it was so beneficial to networking and finding sort of my own voice and using that time almost like as an excuse to work on your dreams, because when you're out of education, then you almost have no excuse to really dream anymore. I know you should, but it's almost like the world doesn't want you to, because you have to get on with work in order to pay your bills and wake up the next day and do it all the same. So in that time you have like the best excuse to just work on everything that you possibly could want to, and I think as long as you set your expectations. I know a lot of people that went into my particular film school that went into it expecting a job or whatever as soon as they graduated. And for certainly the film school I went to, it just doesn't happen. You're there to sort of cut your teeth, and then when you come out, it gives you that impetus and that albeit limited experience to keep going. And a lot of people went there and expected to come out and be like, oh, the BBC are knocking on my door, they want me to direct this thing. It wasn't something that was ever going to become a reality. So I think as long as your expectations are set and you use all that time to your advantage, because obviously one thing that's really cool is that you get unlimited access to the resources there, or the cameras or the equipment and things like this. So that's the outside of still photography, that's the last time I shot on motion picture film, was at film school. 16 and 35 millimeter as well we shot, and that was it's great, just the experience, the tactile nature of using cameras like that. And again, that was all part of, and my networking as well, and that was all part of that film school experience. So I think that as long as you remain true to yourself and your own goals whilst you're there, then you'll be more successful than most.
Awesome. You've gotten me super excited, even more so. So thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
I'm so glad. Enjoy.
Thank you.
That's the main thing.
And I would echo that. As I went to just a 4-year university with a film program, is so many students get caught up in trying to learn the technical side, whether how to light a set or run a camera or use an editor, that they don't learn how to actually tell a story or have something to say.
Right.
So don't get caught up in the technical stuff. That stuff can be learned very quickly, but learning how to tell a story and how to have something to say as a human being living on Earth is so important and so overlooked.
Completely agree. It's a better answer than mine.
All right. Let's bring Mike on up to ask our next question.
Can you hear me? Hey.
Hi.
Thanks for being here, Craig. The movie's fantastic.
Thank you.
Fun story. I only just learned that it was called BIOS. I worked on.
Yeah.
I was a day player electrician on it, and it was
Is that right?
yeah, last movie I did for the union. Honestly,
Wow. So you were in New Mexico with us?
I live in New Mexico, and
That's
I've
amazing.
since just after college, working on set, and yours
That's so cool.
was the latest one I did.
What scenes
and
were you there for?
I was a rigging electrician. I rigged up the stage in advance. I can't even tell you what was there.
Got it. Fair enough.
But I remember, Tom Hanks movie BIOS.
Right.
I didn't know until now that it was Finch. I watched Finch.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
I do have a question, and it's because you also said that you worked on set, and I found that when I started working on set a long time ago, I was sort of fresh out of film school. I had worked on some big features, and was coming to work in production after working in post for a long time, and they were kind of maybe a little bit resentful, like that. They were always telling me like, hey, don't mention that you're like a writer and that you're like a film school guy, like you're a carpenter, or eventually you're an electrician.
Right.
By the time I was an electrician, I knew to keep my mouth shut. But I wondered what your experience was like going back the other way, because it sounds like you were doing like me, working to pay the bills, but working in the film industry because you're around it all the time. But what's the feeling like going back into working with the above the line people? Like, do you feel like there's resentment there at all? Should I keep my mouth shut if I ever get on set in that regard and be like, yo, no, I've never worked in film before? What?
It's a really interesting question. I would say that there's definitely no resentment. I think more than anything, people that I work with are even more interested in terms of my background, because you generally don't get to see both sides of the line. It's very interesting to. I mean, for example, right, when even after the script and package had sold, the nature of deals and pay or play meant that it wasn't until we were like a month away from shooting that I was going to get paid as the writer. You had this sort of small option fee up front, which was a nice little sum of money, and then the real big payment came on much closer to shooting. So I still had to keep my head above water financially. So even after I had sold the screenplay and CAA had signed me and LBI as my management team had signed me, I was still working movie sets. What was I doing? I was working on one of the Fantastic Beasts, the sequel to Fantastic Beasts. I was a daily player on that, and at Leavesden Studios, and I was in between takes. Fortunately, I had a role on set, and I think I can put my hand on my heart and say I think I speak for you as well. In between takes, you don't always have much to do until you turn around or change setups, whatever. And so I was using that time to actually sit down with my laptop outside of the view of the UPM who might be walking through set at any moment, and work on stuff. I was literally working on open writing assignments, anything that was sort of coming my way. And so it was kind of funny to be in that position where I was still working every day, but also I was having this sort of secret life as a writer and having to turn stuff in. And obviously it got to a point where I had to stop working movie sets and focus on this full time, because else, you can't, it wouldn't have been possible. So, and now that obviously I've been on set with producers and I've been sort of above the line, it was nice to actually sit at some monitors on set that I hadn't personally set up myself. That much I can tell you. That was probably the most surreal thing outside of everything, even meeting Tom and everyone else and, seeing him acting and speaking lines that I'd written. The most surreal thing was just sitting at Video Village and I wasn't responsible for it. So there's definitely no resentment from my side of the fence, and I don't think from anyone else's as well. I think that it was, it just makes it more interesting. People are more interested in terms of how you look at things, because you do have that perspective, and I hold it so near and dear. In fact, I think it was even more important than my film school experience, because it was that real world experience that I got afterwards, within a year of graduating, and it was a real eye-opener, and in fact, some of my colleagues who were very successful the moment they graduated, and they went on to directing commercials or something like this, I was having discussions with some of them, and they were actually quite envious, which I found quite shocking of my position at the time, because I was literally going from movie set to movie set, whether it was, a Wachowski set or an Alex Garland set, or working with Chris Miller and Phil Lord, that then became Ron Howard on Solo, and having these different perspectives, in literally working alongside the director and seeing how they run these absolutely, in some cases, absolutely gigantic movie sets, and seeing how they conduct themselves, and just having all of that experience as almost like a frontliner was definitely invaluable to everything, even so far as the writing, because I would always read the screenplays to each and every movie that I was working on, because then, because I'd literally go out of my way, right? I'd go up to the production office and request the screenplay. I'd sign the NDA. Even if I was just a daily player, I'd still go up to the production office and ask to read the screenplay and sign whatever they wanted me to sign, just purely because I was always fascinated with, obviously you get the pages on the day, but seeing it in context is always the best thing to do, because then I would literally be able to digest the entire screenplay, see it in my own head, and then apply that to what we were shooting, and then being like, oh, that's how they're doing it. I remember reading the scene a month ago. That's how they're shooting the scene. That's really interesting, because I've always sort of, and I continue to aspire to directing my own stuff, and ultimately directing other people's stuff would be even nicer. So just keeping the sort of the knives sharp in my own head, it was a really interesting experience, and just as to put the bow on reading, reading screenplays is the number one resource to you as a writer, I think, personally. That, I think, shaped everything about the way I personally write screenplays, is reading them. Whether it's you're reading something and you're thinking, oh, why is this dragging? And then you realize it's because it's 8 or 9 lines, unbroken lines of text. And the moment you open a screenplay, and there's that unwritten rule, right, which is like no more than 4 lines per paragraph. Even things like that, or just the not just the technicalities of the way a screenplay is written, because let's face it, many applications out there like Final Draft or Fade In will do that for us. It's more like the tempo and the cadence of a screenplay. How do I not wax on lyrical about this piece of action, but be really economic about it, to a way that's less is more, and it speaks more to the dynamic of the scene. And obviously the Hive is my introduction to this network was that hive of scripts, but also just reading screenplays all the time, and I was doing that when I was on set as well, as I say. So that was like my film school all over again. It was almost like I had film school itself in the most traditional sense. Then I had film school again when I was actually working on movie sets and seeing how they really function. And then there was film school all over again in reading screenplays. So it's kind of interesting to sort of like cut my teeth 3 times. I'm sorry, I do talk way too much. I am very conscious of that.
Craig, you're making all my dreams come true. This is all super encouraging. This is wonderful.
Oh, amazing. I'm so pleased. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Mike. Okay. I believe we have Aquarius up next. And we have time for a couple more.
Hello, guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning, guys. So, my question is this: I guess based on your experience, what would you say is like a defining moment or like a defining decision for your career that you think made or break your career?
Ooh, the defining moment, I think. Well, first and foremost, it was probably that idea of just not letting go of what it was that I was working on, which was this screenplay. You know, there were so many, in those earlier days when I was trying to get this from a short screenplay of 17 pages into, I was actually trying to get it made as a short film as well with myself as director for probably, I don't know, 2 years, year and a half to 2 years before I finally realized this thing needs to be made as a feature. It's the only way it's ever going to see the light of day. There was a lot of, for every 1,000 emails or phone calls that I would make, and I was literally making that many on a bi-weekly basis or every 2 weeks at most, I would only get like one yes out of 1,000 emails or calls. And obviously when you're in that sort of position, and a lot of people are incredibly nice and obviously you never hear back from, that it can become incredibly disheartening. You know, it's like, does this mean it just doesn't work? What does this mean? And I think it was the never letting go of that. It was the belief in the story, I suppose, not necessarily myself, but just the story, that was probably the most defining thing, because that meant that I was always pushing it forward. You know, I've got some friends from my film school days that are just so stunned more than anything, that because they were aware of this thing, right, as one of my projects at film school, that it's now become what it has, because obviously I never did let it go. So there's probably, that's like the major one. And then the one slightly less than that, less important, would probably be the knocking on someone's door is one thing, but then putting your foot in that door when they try and shut it in your face is something else. And I would honestly, that's what I was doing. I learned to actually put my foot in the door and just be like, there must be a way to make this work. And for instance, I knew Miguel, who ended up becoming the director of Finch. I reached out to him in 2007, which was my first year of film school. And I did that because I read a screenplay called, at the time, Repossession Mambo, which became a film with Jude Law and Forrest Whitaker called Repo Men, which Miguel directed. And I'd read the script, thought it was really cool as a concept. And then I was like, who is directing this thing? Oh, it's this guy. I don't know who this is. What has he done before? And I literally went down that rabbit hole of looking up this guy, and turns out he was on Facebook, and I reached out to him and I just messaged him. We had this back and forth, and obviously 2 years later I had this short script, and I had a back and forth with him about that because he was an established director. He obviously had that film under his belt. He was working on House MD at the time as well. And he almost became like a godfather to it. And that relationship only came about because, you know, I literally was knocking on doors and then put my foot in them as well. And I was doing that everywhere I could go. And for a long time, actually, the short was very close to getting made as a film. I had a visual effects company based in Soho, London, that were going to work on it gratis. There was a special effects company in North England that were going to do all of the special effects. They were going to build Jeff as an animatronic and things like this. They were working on it gratis as well, and that was all because, you know, again, I was knocking on doors and just not taking that first no as the answer. So I think that sort of tenacity as well is something that was definitely a make or break for me in those earlier days. And even if you don't feel like you have the confidence to do that, just pretend that you have the confidence to do that, and then, you know, you can you do it once or twice, you'll get the hang. You'll start to get the hang of it and be like, oh, okay, I can keep doing this.
Awesome. Thank you for the question, Aquarius.
Mark, I don't have a hard out at 12, so feel free to carry on.
Okay, excellent. We'll bring up our next question. So we probably have time for a couple more. If anyone else has a question, please raise your hand.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, it's my first time using it, sorry. I just wanted to know, I'm actually still in undergraduate school. I'm a junior at the University of Florida.
Amazing.
And I switched my major to English because my school doesn't offer like a creative writing or film major, but I do want to focus on creative writing and like screenwriting. I just wanted to know, like, do you have any advice for like what I should be doing right now in school, or even like post grad? Because I don't know yet if I'm going to film school yet. I do want to take direction of just like screenwriting and possibly becoming a director. Like, I want to create my own TV shows or movies.
Yeah.
So I just wanted some advice on that.
Yeah. I think that obviously everyone's journey is always going to be different, you know. Like my journey, I could never recommend my journey because chances are it would never be able to be replicated because it's just, you know, the nature of everyday life. But what I would say is that the number one thing to do, regardless of where you want to turn your attention, whether it is your English course or your studies, is whatever it takes to keep up that level of passion and that drive within yourself, because that's the most important thing, is just keeping that love, that fire burning within you to tell stories, or whether that is in the written form or whether that is in the physical form of filmmaking. Wherever you want to go. For instance, I was offered to study media studies at high school, which was, it was like a shotgun approach to the media industry, whether it was you're interested in radio or journalism or filmmaking. And I didn't do it. I skipped it because I always felt like I knew I wanted to focus on film. And so it didn't feel beneficial to me to look at everything else as well. And then I went to college and studied film production there. And then I went on to film school and studied film production again, and specialized in directing. And each step that I took was always, more than anything, to just service that passion within me, each step that I took was refining it more and more and more, because obviously each level of education became more and more difficult. So it became more and more apparent that this was definitely something that I wanted to pursue first and foremost, because I was actually saying to Mark the other day that it's one thing to fight, like having your voice heard in terms of like, let's say a screenplay that you've got and you want to get sold and therefore made. it's one thing to separate yourself from an incredibly large crowd, and then it's another thing to do it all over again once you have been produced, and because then you're swimming with sharks. It's like the other day I walked into a meeting and I knew that there was, I won't say who it was, but there was a screenwriter up for that assignment that even I'm like a fan of, and it's like, well, why would I ever get this job? Anyway, all of this to say that I think as long as whatever you do, it services that passion and it reminds yourself that this is definitely something you want to do, and this is something, and it keeps that fire alive, it's the right thing to do for you at the time, because that will carry you infinitely further than 99% of other people.
So yeah, I have a 3-part question for you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, get ready.
I am.
Okay. So number 1, do you have any advice on how to write great dialogue? Part 2 is, after Tom Hanks signed on, was any of the dialogue changed to suit him? And part 3, did Tom Hanks request any changes to his dialogue or make any other changes or suggestions?
Interesting triple barrel. Writing good dialogue. Well, the first thing I would say is that obviously with something like science fiction, there's inevitably always going to be exposition to a degree, and that's certainly one of the reasons why we elected not to invent too much for the environment in terms of the science fiction landscape of it, because by inventing, that means that you have to explain, and by explaining you're eating into runtime, it just wasn't interesting to me. There's no point in building out too much of the sci-fi and devote too much time to that. So that in turn minimized the amount of exposition that needed to be written for the script, which obviously in turn influenced the dialogue. I suppose more than anything, I just tried to keep as natural as possible. What would these characters talk about in this situation? How would they talk about that? And just really putting myself in their shoes, and I always go through this process of like, what, for a long time I'd write a screenplay and it'd be like it felt as if I was a freight train running on a railway track that I was still building out in front of me. So I was incredibly sort of slow, and it'd move like 6 feet at a time. Whereas really you want to lay all the track immediately and just do the journey, right? And then you can go back and make sure it's as smooth as possible. So I would say, as long as the dialogue you can almost focus on the dialogue in a whole separate pass. And in fact, that's the way I sort of like to work, is that your first run through that vomit draft, if you like, is whatever it is. As long as you have an outline, you have a rough idea of what that scene is ultimately going to be, then naturally when you go back, you can just keep smoothing that over, and making it sound more and more and more natural as you go. So I think as long as you don't ever expect from yourself that the first time you write dialogue, that's the way it's going to be, then it's always something that's going to be refined, or, in some cases it just doesn't work. And then you want the scene, you realize in the second or third draft, I need this scene to be this rather than that, because I need to get to X or Y place by this point. So then you realize that these scenes need to service something else in the story. And I always think that hiding exposition is the hardest thing with dialogue, because you're forcibly trying to tell the audience something but make it sound natural at the same time. It's almost like the masterclass of that is Inception, I think, because an hour and a half of that movie is nothing but exposition, yet I'm still really entertained. So I would say the secret to writing good dialogue is just never stop working on it. The second one, did Tom change anything with the dialogue? I think was the question.
Well, was anything changed to suit him after he signed on? Was the second question.
The simple answer to that was that obviously being British, there was kind of a British sensibility through it, and certainly with some of the humor as well. So more than anything, it was just sort of we tweaked it a little bit more for a US actor to sound natural with. So he didn't ever specifically request anything changed in the script. In fact, he was an advocate, and something that I hold near and dear, to the fact that nothing was to be changed with the screenplay. That was something that he said very early, which I think was that was like the ultimate validation more than anything.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, he really believed it. And obviously, inevitably, there are some deviations between script and screen, because naturally he's a world-class actor. Why wouldn't he bring something of his own in the moment when they're actually acting these things? And in fact, little things that actually ended up speaking volumes. And the first one off the top of my head wasn't something Tom did, so apologies, Tom. It was actually something that Caleb brought to the script, was his fascination with hands. So the journey from script to screen was always that arc of toddler, teenager, adult that I spoke about before, and the evolution of that, and how that's why he sounds like almost quite Slavic and stunted in his English at the start, and then becomes more Caleb Landry Jones come the end. But that fascination with hands was something that Caleb brought. It's that idea of, okay, this is a character that has been software for, I don't know, 5 years, right? There's nothing but software. And then when he becomes embodied, what's the first thing that he's got a fascination with? Well, it's one thing that he's never had before. It's hands. So it's little things like that, the pair of them that brought to the screen in just really made these characters not just someone in your, like a faceless person in your head when you're writing the script, to this full living and breathing person that and that's the wonderful thing about working with someone like Tom Hanks, is that I had to remind myself that this was a character that I had written, because I was just watching a real person, even when I was on set. It was almost like I was watching a real person, because he's such a world class in making me believe everything, because he brings that very natural performance to everything that he does. So again, long way of saying that he didn't really change too much, but he brought that Tom Hanks level of class to everything.
Very cool. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Craig. This has been fantastic. The last question I have for you is, where does your username come from?
That's a good question. That was obviously, goes back to the movie. I've always been a sort of a quiet fan of that one. I think it's great, but there was just something. It's almost like, well, I'm not a full package. There's still something else that you have to purchase in order to make this thing work. That's kind of my life, So maybe it comes from that. It's that the idea that, well, I can work, but then I also have to. I have to go and do this and make this. I'm speaking rubbish now, but
we're all searching for our batteries.
Good one to end on. Again, better than my answer.
Well,
I'm going to have to interview you at some point.
Well, thank you so much, Craig, and again, congratulations on the film. It's fantastic, and
thank you, Mark.
I can't wait to see what you come out with next, and I look forward to seeing your directorial debut at some point.
Me too.
And audience members, thank you so much for joining us today, and for the
thank you everyone for listening and asking questions. Yes, thank you to everyone.
And we will see everybody soon. So take care and have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.